Morgan, and today I will be reading Chapter 9 of Charity's Chosen by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 9. It was surprising to Charity that directly after the wedding, life resumed its normal monotony. When she came downstairs the following morning, there was no trace to be seen of yesterday's festivities. Even the little silver slippers and scattered confetti had been swept away from the garden and the street outside, and only the faint, sweet scent of lilies still lingered in the house, a reminder of what had passed. Charity breakfasted alone, and then went to the library, but her thoughts were not with her work. She kept thinking first of Myrtle, and then of Hugh Heather, and asking herself one great, unanswerable question. Why could they not have found happiness together? What was wrong with life that it could not be made smooth for two people who loved one another? Myrtle and her husband were going first of all to Paris, and then across to Spain and North Africa. "I don't care where we go, as long as it's somewhere where the sun shines," Myrtle had told Pelham. She had taken no interest in her honeymoon. "One place is the same as another," she said to Charity when the girl eagerly questioned her. It would not have been the same to Charity, and she supposed shrewdly that neither would it have been the same to Myrtle if Heather had been with her. And back came her thoughts to the same question. Why? Why? She sat down on the library floor with a scatter of books all around her, and rested her chin in the palm of her hand. She seemed to have been in England such a long time. She seemed to have learned so much since her tear-blinded eyes looked their last on the sunlit harbor of Sydney. She had thought then that it would be impossible ever to find happiness again, and yet in some measure she had found it. She seemed to have made a corner for herself in this unfriendly household, and she knew that even her aunt was reconciled to her presence there, even if she was not entirely glad of it. And this afternoon she was to see Hugh Heather. Her heart leapt at the thought of it, even though she knew he would not be glad to see her, that he might even hate her because she had come in the place of the woman he loved. "He's to blame as much as Myrtle is," Charity told herself as she remembered her own fruitless journey to his rooms with Myrtle's olive branch. "He might have been kinder to her then. I am sure he is a man who could be perfectly beastly if he liked." But the realization did not alter the fact that her pulses leapt at the thought of him, and that she was counting the moments till they met. "Even if he is rude to me, and says he hates me, I shall have seen him," she told herself with a warm glow at her heart, and then she started guiltily to her feet as the door opened and her uncle came in. "It works so early," he said. Charity laughed apologetically. "I don't think I've done much work yet. I was thinking." "Interesting thoughts?" he asked. Charity hesitated, then told him. "I was thinking of Myrtle." "Ah." He turned and looked down at her, a sorry little expression in his eyes. "Poor Myrtle," he said compassionately. "She may be very happy," Charity said swiftly. He nodded his white head. "Yes, she may, but you and I both know that nowadays the impossible seldom, if ever, happens." He sat down at his writing table, and Charity began hurriedly to sort the scattered books at her feet. There was silence for some time, and she found herself looking at the clock again and again. Presently she gathered courage and spoke. "Uncle, I wonder if I could have this afternoon off." Mr. Atfield turned round. "Is there any need to ask me?" he queried. Charity nodded. "I didn't work yesterday, you see." "Well, there's no need for you to work today, either," he told her. "You're a good little girl. You've been very helpful to me." She flushed with pleasure, and he asked again, "What are you going to do this afternoon?" "I'm only going for a walk." "A walk?" "Yes, in Kensington Gardens." Charity had no idea where Kensington Gardens were, but Myrtle had told her that anyone would know. "Well," her uncle said gravely, "it costs money even to walk in Kensington Gardens," and he took a £5 note from his pocketbook and gave it to her. Charity gasped. "Oh, all for me?" "All for you. Just a little payment for that," and he indicated the neat row of shelves on the walls opposite. "I've never had so much money in my life," Charity said. She hesitated a moment, then went across to him. "I should like to kiss you, if I may," she said shyly. She thought at first that he would refuse. Then he chuckled, the quiet chuckle of a man who seldom laughs, and he turned his head towards her. "Well, I dare say I can bear it if you can," he said. Charity kissed him with all her heart. "I think you're a perfect darling," she told him impulsively. "It is a great many years since anyone has said anything half so charming to me," he answered. He told Charity he should not expect to see her at all after lunch. Walks should be taken early, and while the sun shines, if it is shining today," he added, with a glance towards the window. "It's tried to once or twice," Charity answered. She hurried through her lunch in the deserted schoolroom. The house seemed very quiet after the noise and excitement of yesterday. Ellen, who brought up the tray, told her that Mrs. Atfield was still in bed and intended staying there until it was time to get up and dress for an evening festivity. "And Mr. Harvey, he's in bed too," she said contemptuously. Ellen did not like Harvey. "Harvey stays there," Charity said with a vicious little snap, and they both laughed together. Charity was out of the house before 2:30, with her precious 5-pound note in an old purse tightly clasped in her hand. She was going to buy a new hat and some new shoes before she met Heather, little brown suede shoes with a single strap like those in which Myrtle had gone away yesterday, and real silk stockings of the new beaver shade. It seemed the most wonderful day in her life as she walked shyly into a big store and was directed to the ladies' department. "There's no need to be nervous," she kept telling herself proudly. "You've got the money to pay for them. There's no need at all to be nervous." Fortunately, she was served by a sympathetic girl with limitless patience, who did not even smile when Charity informed her that it was the first time she had ever had a pretty pair of shoes in her life, and who took down box after box for her inspection before finally she decided what she wanted. There was not much change out of the 5-pound note, for unwittingly Charity had walked into a most expensive shop. But she did not mind. She left her own shoes to be sent home, and wore the new ones on her proud little feet when she went out into the street again. It was 3:30 then, so with a feeling that perhaps Kensington Gardens might be many miles away, and that she might be late for her appointment with Heather, Charity put aside the idea of a new hat, and boldly inquired her way of a friendly constable. He looked down at her from his great height, and smiled as he would have smiled at a child. "Take a number 10 bus from the opposite corner," he said, and then when he saw her glance at the stream of traffic and obviously hesitate to cross the road, he magnanimously stretched out the arm of the law and cleared a way for her to pass. "Oh, thank you," Charity said gratefully. She thought London was full of the kindest people she could ever hope to meet, and she included the bus conductor in the same category when he pulled the bell cord and stopped the bus for her especial benefit when they reached the Brompton Road. "And mind how you cross over, missy," he said. Charity crossed without mishap. Her eyes were very bright, and her cheeks rosy with excitement as she entered the gardens and asked a girl with a perambulator which was the way to the Peter Pan statue. "I don't know London very well yet," she apologized. The girl stared at her, then smiled. Somehow people always felt as if they must smile with kindly earnest when Charity spoke to them. She looked so young and appealing. "It's quite close," she assured her. "I'm going that way myself. I'll show you." Charity was very grateful. "I don't know why people ever get lost in London," she said frankly. "Everyone is so kind and helpful." She felt quite sorry to part with her new friend when they came to Peter Pan, but she knew that at any moment she might meet Heather, and she wanted a few moments in which to collect her agitated thoughts. Supposing he refused to speak to her, or hear what she had come to tell him. It was a possibility, certainly. Her heart beat faster as she remembered how he had caught her in his arms that last time she went to his rooms, and his own sneering accusation. "I suppose you thought I was going to kiss you." That ought to have made her angry, she knew, and yet she had answered him. "I think I hoped you were. It had been bold of her to say that, and yet, why not, when it was the simple truth? And then she thought of her dream in which Heather had said, "I want to kiss you. May I, Charity?" But how could that dream ever come true when he loved Myrtle? She walked a dozen yards past Peter Pan and back again. The suede shoes were not quite so comfortable now as they had been when she first put them on. The heels were higher than those she was used to wearing, and the soles much thinner. Charity sighed. There always seemed something, no matter how small, to spoil one's happiness. Then the blood rushed to her face in a crimson wave, and her heart seemed to stop beating as she saw Heather coming towards her. He was walking rather fast, and he wore a big rough overcoat, and a soft gray felt hat sat on his head at a rather rakish. He was walking rather fast, and he wore a big rough overcoat, and a soft gray felt hat sat on his head at rather a rakish angle. His hands were thrust deep into his coat pockets, and he looked eagerly preoccupied. There's no one like him in the world, no one, Charity thought with a queer throb of passion, and then she remembered that it was to meet Myrtle that he came so eagerly, and that she herself was less than nothing to him. He did not see her as he drew near, and he would have passed by, but that she stepped aside right into his path. "Mr. Heather," He pulled up sharply and stared down at her. Then a half-smile broke over his face. "You? Good Lord! I was thinking of you a moment ago. Were you?" There was an eager note in her voice. "Were you really? What about?" He laughed. He could never rid himself of the idea that Charity was just a child to be tolerated, and not a young woman of 20 who had been so very indiscreet as to once admit that she liked him more than she ought to have done. "I was thinking that last time we met I was rather rude to you." Charity shook her head. "I didn't mind, and I'm sure you didn't mean to be," she said kindly. "Didn't I? I'm not so sure. Anyway," he broke off, and a different expression came into his face. "I suppose you haven't come here to meet me, by any chance?" he asked with rough suspicion. For a moment Charity's courage failed her. Then she bravely told the truth. "Yes, Myrtle sent me." She saw the bleak disappointment in his face, and her heart gave a quick throb of pity. No wonder he hated her. She always seemed to be thrust into his life when it was Myrtle he wanted to see. He stood looking away from her down the wind-swept garden, past the statue of Peter Pan, who smiled on serenely, untouched by human passion, and for a little while he seemed to forget that he was not alone, till Charity said timidly, "There's a seat over there. Can't we sit down? I've got a lot of things to tell you, Mr. Heather." He roused himself with a start, but when he spoke it was not in answer to her question, but in further perusal of his own bitter thoughts. "Where is Myrtle, then?" Charity's lips parted, but no words came. How could she tell him the truth, and how was it that he did not know? She said again, "Can't we sit down on that seat? I'm tired and—" She glanced down at her feet self-consciously. "My shoes are new. They're not too comfortable." Heather did not even glance at her shoes, and Charity felt a chill disappointment. "I don't know why you women will wear such absurdly high heels," he said irritably. He turned and led the way towards the seat. "It's too cold to sit down," he declared, "but if your feet hurt—" Charity wished she had not mentioned her feet, and she sat down offendedly some distance from him. There was a little silence, then he said bluntly, "Well, where is Myrtle? I suppose every other engagement comes before a meeting with me." Charity began, then stopped, only to break out again in distress. "Oh, Mr. Heather, don't you ever read the newspapers?" She would have given 10 years of her life if it had not been necessary to tell him the truth, but there was no help for it, and Heather turned his head sharply and looked at her. "Newspapers? What do you mean? I've been abroad. I came from Paris on the night train. I only got in this morning." Then he saw the agitation of her face and her tremulous lips, and his own face grew white. "Why, what is there in the newspapers that could be of particular interest to me?" he asked slowly, and then, as she did not speak, he asked again with an effort, "What is it? You need not be afraid to tell me. Is it—" He caught his breath as if with sudden dread. "Is she engaged? Is that it, Charity?" Charity shook her head. If it had cost her her life, she could not have spoken. Heather laughed. Not engaged? Well, that's something. It can't be anything worse unless—" Then, all of a sudden, he seemed to understand, and such a look of fear crept into his eyes that Charity almost cried out, and for a long moment they stared breathlessly at one another, till Heather said again, in a voice so strained and unnatural that she hardly recognized it, She's not married." Charity found speech in a broken whisper. "Yesterday, to Richard Pelham. Oh, Mr. Heather, I'm so sorry, so very sorry." She dared not look at him as she spoke. Her eyes were swimming in tears, and she kept them fixed on the gravel path at her feet, while she waited tremblingly for him to speak. But the moments crept by, and she counted them by her thudding heartbeats. But still Heather was silent, and at last in desperation she turned her head and looked at him. And then, for the first and last time in her life, Charity thought him an ugly man. His face was livid, and seemed to have aged years in so many moments. She was conscious only of the iron grayness of his hair above the temples, the lines about his eyes, and the cruel contraction of his heavy brows. He looked the brute which Harvey had declared he could be when he chose, and for a moment Charity's courage failed her. She was afraid of him, and she wanted to get up and run away, and then in a moment everything was swallowed up in a great pity, and she laid a trembling hand on his arm to say again, "Oh, Mr. Heather, I'm so sorry, so very sorry." He shook her away as if she had hurt him, and without a word, he rose to his feet and strode off into the gathering dusk of the afternoon. Charity waited up for a petrified second, staring after him, her dark eyes tragic, Her lips parted. Then she scrambled to her feet, and regardless of tight shoes, she ran after him. Mr. Heather! He must have heard, but he did not turn or slacken his speed, and she had to continue running in order to keep up with him. "Oh, wait, please wait," she panted. "I shan't leave you, no matter how fast you go, so you'd better wait for me." He half turned and scowled down at her. "Go away," he said in a savage voice, as if he were speaking to an importunate beggar. "Leave me alone, do you hear?" "If you just let me say something," Charity implored. There were tears in her voice, and her breath came in broken gasps, and all of a sudden Heather came to an impatient standstill. "Well, what do you want?" he demanded. She faced him for a moment, unable to speak. Then, with an effort, she said, "It wasn't her fault. They made her, and you were there, and after all, you did refuse to answer her last letter, didn't you?" She was trying to do her best to defend Myrtle, even while all her sympathies were with Heather, and in her heart she was crying out over and over again, "How could she? Oh, how could she?" Heather said nothing, and she went on again valiantly. "You ought to have stayed with her. You ought to have made her marry you. She's so weak, anybody could influence her." Heather laughed savagely. "She's no use to me then. I only hope to God she's as unhappy as—" "You brute!" said Charity. Then, quite suddenly, she burst into tears. Fortunately, they were in a deserted part of the garden. Nurses and their charges were going home, glad to get out of the wind, and nobody was near enough to observe them or to be unduly interested. Heather stared at her for a moment. Then he said gruffly, "What on earth are you crying for? It makes no difference to you, does it? You weren't fond of her as I am." No," said Charity brokenly, "but I'm fond of you." "Oh, good Lord!" There was distaste in his voice and in his face, but he looked less fierce, and presently he said more quietly, "Well, stop crying anyway if you can, and answer a few questions. Were you at the wedding?" Yes." Where were they married?" She told him, adding in a broken voice, "and she looked lovely." She heard him catch his breath. Then after a moment he said sharply, "Dry your eyes and let's walk on. Do you want all London staring at you?" "I don't care if you don't," Charity said. "Well, I do care," he answered, and they walked on slowly, Heather's hands thrust into his pockets, his shoulders hunched together, making him look somehow like an old man. His figure reminded Charity a little of her father's, and an additional pang touched her heart. "You won't always be so hurt and angry," she said clumsily, in her great anxiety to help and comfort him. "I've come to the conclusion," she added quaintly, "that you can get over anything, if only you wait." She glanced up at him with hopeful dark eyes. "When I came to England, I only wanted to die. I hoped I should, but now I don't think England's half such a bad place. In fact, sometimes I'm quite happy. Really, I am." "I'm delighted to hear it," he told her with bitter sarcasm. "And you will be too," she rushed on, thinking she had made headway. "Someday you'll meet another girl who you'll like much better than Myrtle, and then you'll be able to laugh at today and—" "What are you laughing at now?" Heather checked himself suddenly. "Out of the mouths of babes and sucklings," he quoted. He stood still again. "Well, you'd better go home. I'll put you on a bus that will take you to the end of your road. And what will you do?" He shrugged his heavy shoulders. "What do you think I'm going to do? Jump into the river?" Charity paled. "Oh, don't say such dreadful things," she begged. He stared at her with somber eyes. "Well, anyway, it's no business of yours," he said bluntly. "I'll put you on a bus." "I should like some tea first," Charity said boldly. She did not really want any tea, but her feet were aching terribly. She felt as if her new shoes, of which she had been so proud a moment ago, were lined with pincers, and something in her heart warned her that it was not wise to leave him alone just now. "Well, London is full of tea shops," Heather said. Charity told a pious lie. "I know it is, but I haven't got any money. I'll lend you some. I'd rather you came with me," she said quickly. The ugly scowl came back to his face. "Why should I? I've told you before to keep out of my way. Other people have told you the same thing. Myrtle was wise to marry that brute, although I'm no worse than he is, God knows. Well, come along. We'll find a tea shop." They left the gardens and crossed Cromwell Road. "You always walk so fast?" Charity asked, stumbling along beside him. He slowed down ungraciously. "I'm sorry. I'm not used to the company of girls like you." "I thought you liked women," Charity said unthinkingly, remembering what Harvey had told her. The color deepened in his face. "Not women like you," he said shortly. "Well, I always knew you didn't care much about me," Charity admitted with a sigh. Heather glanced at her suspiciously. Was she entirely innocent, or was she the very deepest of her sex? He asked himself irritably. Anyway, it was of no interest to him. He would give her her tea and send her home. After all, she had tried to be kind, poor child. He piloted her into a tea shop and chose a corner table. Charity took off her gloves and her coat, and finally her hat. Heather stared at her. She looked so quaint and ridiculously young, with her shock of dark hair standing up so stiffly. "Why don't you keep your hat on?" he demanded irritably, conscious of the attention they were attracting. "My head aches," Charity explained, "and I hate hats anyway. I never wore a hat before I came to England, except when the sun was very hot." Heather was not interested. When she poured out his tea, he left it standing and refused to eat anything. "The bread and butter is nice," Charity said hopefully. He made no answer, till suddenly he asked with irrelevance, "I suppose all London was there?" She was quick to grasp his meaning. "Yes, Harvey said there were nearly 400 people in church." He laughed harshly. "They would make a show, of course. Bridesmaids in a satin train, and all the rest of the mockery, eh?" Charity nodded. There was a silence. "And she got my letter. When?" he asked presently. "When she came back from the church," Charity whispered. "And she told you about it?" "Yes, she said there was nobody else she could trust. I hope you don't mind?" Charity asked painfully. "Why should I mind?" But his eyes softened as they rested on her elfin face. "What is there about you that forces one's confidence?" he asked, and it sounded as if he were angry. "I don't know," Charity answered, bewildered. "And what did she say?" he urged after a moment. Charity hesitated. "She cried?" He made an impatient gesture. "It was always easy for her to cry." "Well, this time it wasn't," Charity insisted. "She was dreadfully afraid of crying. She knew she would spoil the look of herself. She made me promise to see you for her. She said, 'Ask him not to think too badly of me.' She said, 'Tell him that if ever I cared for anyone at all, it was for him.'" Charity's voice quivered, and she dared not raise her eyes. "Well, go on," he said hoarsely. "I think that's all. She didn't tell you what was in my letter?" "Yes. She said that something had happened which would alter both your lives." Heather laughed. "Can you guess what it was?" he asked. She shook her head. "Something to do with another girl," she hazarded, remembering Harvey's stories. He repeated the last two words, not understanding. "Another girl? I have no other girl. No, it's to do with the only thing Myrtle ever really troubled about. Money." "Oh?" "You can tell her this when you see her," he went on harshly. "You can tell her this when she and that blackguard she has married come back from their honeymoon. Tell her that my luck turned at the tables. Tell her that I came back from Monte Carlo this time with £25,000. He leaned across the table, staring at her, as if to drive his words home. "Can you remember that, do you think? £25,000. "Is it a lot of money?" Charity asked. Heather sat back in his chair, his vehemence dying away. "It's a bit to go on with," he said cynically, "even for a woman like Myrtle." "I'll tell her," Charity promised. Under cover of the table she had quietly kicked off her shoes, and the relief to her aching feet had sent her spirits up by leaps and bounds. Even if Heather's thoughts were with somebody else all the time, at any rate he was near her, and she could look at him as often as she chose. "Have you had enough tea?" he asked abruptly. "Oh, yes, thank you. Better put on your hat, then." He turned in his chair and called for the bill. Charity met his eyes, her own filled with dismay. "I took my shoes off just now, and I'm afraid I shan't be able to get them on very easily," she said faintly. "Well, I hope you don't expect me to carry you home," Heather said sourly. Then suddenly he smiled, and instantly his whole face was transformed, so that Charity smiled too, in swift and eager sympathy. Heather said sourly, then suddenly he smiled, and instantly his whole face was transformed, so that Charity smiled too, in swift and eager sympathy. I can manage if I don't put my heels quite in," she said. "You baby, you want to nurse in a perambulator," Heather answered. He waited while she groped about under the table. Then when she said in a doubtful little voice, "I think I can manage now," they rose and left the shop together, Charity walking in little mincing steps in an effort not to leave her brand-new shoes behind. Outside, Heather hailed a taxicab, but to Charity's relief he did not send her away alone, but got in beside her when he had given the address. "I suppose I'd better see you safely home," he said resignedly, and Charity answered, "I could have been all right by myself, but I'd rather you came with me." But he was very silent during the drive, only speaking to ask if she would rather have the window up or down. "I don't care which," Charity said obligingly. "Whichever you like." Heather let them both down. "When shall I see you again?" she asked nervously when they were nearly home. Heather roused himself with an effort. "Oh, I dare say we shall tumble across one another sometime," he answered evasively. Charity turned her dark eyes upon him. "You don't seem very anxious to see me any more," she said with a pained note in her voice. Heather's face softened. "It's a good thing for you that I am not," he answered briefly, and then the taxicab stopped and he jumped out. "Well, goodbye, and thank you." He did not offer to shake hands, and he got back into the cab without once glancing after her, but Charity stood at the gate in the dusk for some time after he was out of sight, and her heart was torn with anxiety. "I wonder what he's going to do. I wish I knew." But she knew the following morning, when Harvey came to the library where she was trying in vain to keep her attention on the long and dreary catalogues. "Gad, my head aches," he said, flopping down into one of his father's big chairs. Charity glanced at him briefly. "I suppose you've been out all night," she said witheringly. "You suppose right, my child," he answered. "I've been out all night, and with that king amongst men, Heather." If he had hoped to betray her interest, he was disappointed. Charity had learned to disguise her feelings, at any rate in Harvey's presence, and she went on steadily adding to her list. "We made merry together," Harvey added. "How silly," said Charity, but her heart began to thud. Harvey laughed. "Yes, you ought to have seen the king amongst men last night," he said, "or rather in the early hours of the morning. Raving drunk he was, and swearing that he would shoot Pelham the first time they met." Charity shivered. "I believe he meant it, too," Harvey went on with a sort of satisfaction. "Don't blame him, either. You see, it's the second time Pelham's pinched the girl Heather wanted." Charity's steadily moving pencil was stilled for a moment, and she raised her head. "The second time?" she echoed faintly. "Has Mr. Heather been in love before, then?" Harvey laughed uproariously. "In love before? My dear child, his little affairs are as numerous as the sands of the sea. I've known him for years, and he's always half off his head about somebody or other." Charity sat back on her heels. "And who was the other girl Mr. Pelham pinched?" she asked quietly. Harvey looked slightly abashed. "Well, I told you there was supposed to be a girl down in the country somewhere, didn't I? That's the one. Pelham treated her badly, and Heather played the perfect little gentleman and took her under his wing." "How did Mr. Pelham treat her badly?" "You'd better ask him for details if you want them. I only know the general facts of the case, as everyone else knew them. Pelham's a devil where women are concerned." "Does Myrtle know?" "I should think it's quite probable. It wouldn't make any difference to her if she did know. He's married her. The mater saw to that, and she's got his money." Charity's cheeks flamed. "I think you're a perfectly hateful family," she stormed. She expected him to be angry, but he only laughed. "Do you? Well, that's a pity, because for some obscure reason, we all seem to rather like you." He sat up with sudden interest. "Have you ever thought of getting married, Charity?" She was quick to read the meaning in his eyes. "Not to you, anyway," she said sharply. He was taken aback. "You might wait till you're asked. I only thought I'd warn you not to bother about it," Charity answered coolly. She rose to her feet. "You'd better go. Your father will be here in a minute, and you know he doesn't like you in his room." "I never came until you started on his books." "You need not come for my sake." "I don't. I come for my own." Charity ignored his meaning and continued her work. "Did you know that Heather had scooped the pool at Monday?" Harvey asked presently. "Yes, if by that you mean that he won some money. He told me himself." A little gleam flashed into Harvey's eyes. "What did you see him then?" he demanded jealously. "He's only been back 2 days." "Well, I've seen him," Charity said calmly, though her pulses stirred. She wished she had been more cautious. Harvey rose to his feet. "Have you been to his rooms again?" he demanded. Charity raised indignant eyes. "It's no business of yours where I've been." She was surprised at his angry expression. "So he's going to start his little games on you now, is he?" Harvey said roughly. "Well, if you're fool enough to be so cheap." She did not look up, and he bent and caught her hand. "You little idiot, Charity! I can give you a far better time than he ever could. I don't know what you can see in Heather. He drinks too much. So do you." She flashed back. He grew surprisingly grave. I never will again if you ask me not to." For a moment they looked at one another, ardent admiration in his eyes, but only distasteful surprise in hers. Then she jerked her hand away. "I don't care what you do," she said in exasperation, "and I wish you'd go away. I'm busy." He stood erect, his breath coming quickly, his eyes on her face. "You wouldn't send Heather away if he were here, would you?" he asked jealously. "No," Charity admitted. "Well, what's the difference? I'm your cousin." Charity rose to her feet. "I don't like you, and I do like him," she said defiantly. He flushed at her candor. "There's not much pride There's not much pride about you, anyway, he sneered, throwing herself at a man's head. Charity picked up the book nearest her and flung it at him. Fortunately, it missed, but it went crashing on to the writing table and upset an ink pot, and all the ink went streaming merrily over the leather top and made a little black pool on the Persian carpet. Harvey laughed gleefully. There you are, see what your temper's done, he jeered. Charity looked at him with flashing eyes. If you don't go, I'll throw another, she threatened in a deadly quiet voice. And if I do, next time I shan't miss. She was on her knees mopping up the ink with blotting paper when her uncle came in, and he stopped in the doorway, peering at her with his clever, short-sighted eyes. Why, my dear, Charity raised a flushed face. I threw a book at Harvey, she said in blunt explanation, and it missed and hit the ink pot. I'm sorry, but I don't think it will show very much. There was a quiet smile in the old man's eyes. What did Harvey do to cause you to throw a book at him? He asked. Charity was silent for a moment. Then she laughed. It wasn't anything that really mattered, but it made me angry, and I wanted to hurt him. I see. He crossed the room and sat down at the table. Next time, he said after a moment, take better aim. I am sure that it would not do Harvey any harm to have a book thrown at his head sometimes. Uncle! He turned round in his chair and looked at her whimsically. Well, don't you agree? He asked. They laughed together. And that is the end of Chapter 9 of Charity's Chosen by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you join me again soon for the next one. Have a great day!